The very first paper that I published was in 1972. It appeared in the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute, which at that time was still called Man. It was entitled The Marsupial in Nuaulu Ritual Behavior and had been awarded the Firth Prize at the LSE. Although not apparent to me at the time, this essay on Nuaulu thinking and practices related to a species of arboreal cuscus or falanga contained themes that were to characterize my later writing on ethnobiological classification, particularly the connection between empirical knowledge of difference in morphology and behavior of animal types, and how this linked with the symbolic purposes to which animals were put, especially in ritual. A similar set of linkages were to be explored by me a little later, 1999, in relation to Nuaulu attitudes towards dogs. This is a paper called Categories of Animality and Canine Abuse that I published in Anthropos. One thing that concerned me from quite early on was that anthropologists writing about environmental relations often knew very little about the environments they invoked, from both a scientific and from a local perspective, and certainly lacked systematic information about the non-human organisms that constituted those environments. My interest in ethnobiological classification in a wider and more formal sense had been cultivated during my first period in the field with the Nuaulu between 1969 and 1971, when I'd collected animal specimens for the Natural History Museum in London. On the strength of this trip, experience, trips to Nuaulu land in 1973 and 1975 focused specifically on animal classification. I had been much influenced by the writings of Harold Conklin and especially Ralph Bulmer. Indeed, in 1975, I was accompanied in the field by a man called James Menzies, a zoologist who had worked with Ralph amongst the Kalam in New Guinea, and who was of particular help in sorting out Nuaulu knowledge of bats, frogs, and other small mammals. I could never have appreciated the significance of frog vocalization, for example, and the way the Nuaulu distinguished different species, were it not for James's input. While my first networked computer work station was named Bulmer in honor of Ralph's impact on my work. These various interests came together in 1978 in the organization of a conference, again at the University of Kent, with my then colleague, David Reason. Reason was a polymath who respected no disciplinary allegiance, though he had been trained as a mathematical sociologist. The conference proceedings were published in 1979 as classifications in their social context, and the introduction, written by me, developed themes that would subsequently become important in my work. Although I published a series of papers on different aspects of Nuaulu animal classification and knowledge, the entirety would come together in 1993 with the publication of The Cultural Relations of Classification, which was a sort of synthetic analysis of Nuaulu animal categories. My initial objective was simply to document the similarities and differences between Nuaulu understandings of animal types and those of scientific zoology. But at that time, it was difficult not to be drawn into the current theoretical debates. On the one hand, Brent Berlin and his collaborators were promoting a strong model which claimed that all folk biological classification cut nature at the joints, as he put it, that classifications were everywhere the same, organized through a common logic. The more extreme version of this was found in the work of Scott Atran, which would treat it deeply within the context of evolutionary psychology and memetics. There was little doubt that Berlin provided a good framework for testing cross-cultural variation. But I was also up against the social constructivist interpretations of a kind promoted by Mary Douglas, ultimately derived from a reading of Marcel Mauss and Emil Durkheim. While I could see the attractiveness of the strong model of Berlin, the cultural relations of classification, in effect, became in part a critique of Berlin, as well as a dig at Douglas, mainly because Berlin had so dominated the formative phase of cognitive ethnobiology. I admired the rigor he had introduced into the study of ethnobiological classification, and despite my scholarly objectives, we later got to know each other very well, and I visited him and gave lectures at the University of Georgia, where he later moved after his period in Berkeley. My position on the Berlinian project was much more in line with that taken by Eugene Hun, who had been a student of Berlin. And I got involved also at this time with the work of the International Society of Ethnobiology. Classifying, it seemed to me, was much more than an act or succession of acts. It was a contextually bound process, the sum total of empirical processes determined by interaction between knowledge, context, purpose, and cognitive architecture, which gives rise to particular classificatory outcomes. In scientific taxonomy, no less than in folk classification. So we could view scientific taxonomies in the context of the history of Western science in a way that was really no different from the way we might look at folk classifications. This process, contextualizing classifications as they emerged in particular context, I called prehension. On the other hand, in populations without literacy, there could be no explicit overall synthetic classification with multiple non-overlapping contrasting levels, which could only be achieved with graphic or pictorial aids. Something called the Nuaulu animal classification is difficult for Nuaulu to themselves to articulate. These things only come with the overview, stability, and reflexivity made possible by the written mode. Classificatory acts, I concluded, are always contingent. They often overlap. Classifying as a process is the key and much more flexible than classifications as a cultural end product. Okay,